So burnout, we begin then by reminding ourselves of some important truths about who we are as human beings. We are not merely bodies, we are embodied souls, we are psychosomatic wholes. And every time I speak on aspects of medicine and psychiatry in particular, then I come back to this because it is just fundamental. We are not bodies, as some of our materialist colleagues would want us to believe. We are souls as well. And these two, our bodies and souls, interact continuously in ways that we do not understand in this world, but nonetheless which are real and which we always have to take into account. Now, our materialist colleagues, people I work with then, would very much emphasize the body and want to trace everything that goes wrong with us as human beings to the body. And that's something that we often feel more comfortable with, isn't it? The body is something we can see as you see me now with your physical eyes. It's solid, we can touch it, we can handle it, and we're comfortable with it, as it were, medically. We can think in terms of anatomy and physiology and the pathologies of different parts of the body. But what about the spirit or soul or mind? And I use these terms interchangeably for that non-material part of our being. Well, of course, this is just as real. Indeed, in some senses, if you like, more real than the physical, because God himself is spirit, isn't he? It was spirit that generated the physical, though the material, not the other way round. And that's something I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of, that the physical is something that came from the spirit, from God, who is spirit. And so our mind and spirit, we tend to think of it as something not substantial, something a bit feeble, something a bit ethereal, something that's not something somehow quite as important, perhaps, as the body. Now, as Christians, we can still drift into that. But because God is spirit, because we are spirit, because the spirit we know continues after the removal of the body at death, this is something that is real, more real than our bodies. And like our bodies, it's damaged. Again, I think that's something we sometimes struggle with as Christians. We are psychosomatic wholes when Adam sinned, when he brought the human race then under the curse from the Lord. It wasn't simply our physical that was damaged, was it? Again, we're comfortable, as it were, with sickness in the body, but sickness in the mind or soul, then that's something perhaps we're not so comfortable with. But the logic of that discomfort would be that somehow the soul, our spiritual aspect, has not been affected by the fall or by God's curse more specifically in the same way. That somehow it's our body that's damaged, but somehow our spirit or soul remains pristine and untouched by the curse. And yet that is not so, surely. The fact that we don't quite understand it in the same way as the body, that we can't measure it and touch it and handle it in the same way, should not, I think, lead us to kind of pretend that somehow it's exempt from the curse. Now, our souls are damaged too. We have damaged spirits or minds within, as it were, our damaged bodies. And so we're psychosomatically wholly damaged beings. And some kinds of illness are more physical, if we like. Some kinds are more mental or spiritual in the sense of damaged souls. But wherever the balance lies, both parts are always involved in any kind of illness. We're holistically damaged. So the modern kind of medical approach that all illnesses are physical in some sense, we do not adhere to. Then there's the view that sometimes Christians hold that somehow we can separate physical and mental, but again that's false because we're psychosomatic wholes. Any physical illness involves the mind, any mental illness involves the body. If we choose to put the emphasis on the mind and say this is a mental illness, we should never think that somehow our body is not involved. If we choose to emphasize that this is a physical illness, we should never think that the mind is not involved because we are holistic beings. Okay, so with that preamble then, important background, we come to burnout. So what do we mean by burnout? Well, when John asked me to speak on this subject, I was happy to do so, and yet I had some reservation because, in fact, burnout is not a diagnosable entity in psychiatry. So DSM here is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's used for psychiatric diagnosis today. And burnout is not in DSM, but it is in the International Classification of Diseases, current version 11. So the sense there are other doctors who might be better placed to deal with burnout than myself. And that gave me some discomfort. But on the other hand, I did find it odd that burnout isn't included, given the number of odd conditions that are included in DSM, and given the fact that burnout is very much a kind of mentally driven condition. But what is it then? Well, ICD defines it using these 4 kind of components here. It's occupational, work-related, first of all. So it's an occupational condition that involves both physical and mental exhaustion, and that's the language used in ICD, which reflects well then what I've just been saying about who we are as human beings, doesn't it? We are psychosomatic, physical and mental beings. And it then leads to this negativism about one's work and reduced work efficiency. So it's an occupation-related condition, burnout, which involves these 3 domains of exhaustion, negativism, and poor work or reduced work performance. So what isn't it? What isn't it? It's always worth thinking what other conditions might be mistaken for burnout. Well, we're well aware with so-called long COVID of so-called viral fatigue syndromes. And these have been long recognized. Long COVID is a variation on that today. But then that's clearly something that follows on from an illness which has wiped somebody out, and they take a long time to recover from that. Then there's chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome is not then occupation related, and it's more of a bodily exhaustion syndrome than burnout, which involves very much a strong mental component to the fatigue or exhaustion. And then there's depression that's often mistaken, or sometimes deliberately diagnosed instead of burnout for reasons of convenience. Depression then is clearly driven by low mood or sadness. That's the prominent feature, with loss of pleasure, and tiredness, fatigue is present in depression, but it's secondary. It's not as prominent. It's driven by the low mood. So these are differentiable entities for these reasons from burnout. So what features should we look for or think about in burnout? Well, I've mentioned the 3 different domains of symptoms, work-related. So exhaustion, physical and mental. So as I said, the physical is less prominent, though it's always going to be there, somebody feeling very tired. But that isn't what dominates as in chronic fatigue syndrome, because away from a work situation, somebody can function much better, which isn't the case with chronic fatigue. But it's the mental side, the soul fatigue, with impaired intellectual performance, that difficulty in concentrating and remembering and thinking clearly. There's the emotional elements of fatigue that lead to irritability and an emotional instability. You and I may experience that sometimes when we're tired. We get tired at such times. We're aware that we are more labile, more up and down emotionally, and we are therefore more prone to irritable and even angry outbursts. This emotional fatigue is prominent then in burnout. And so this isn't the same, that kind of emotional exhaustion isn't the same then as low mood in depression. There's sadness, but that's not the same thing as this kind of irritable emotional exhaustion that you have. I haven't put it on here. There's really loss of willpower as well, if you might, volitional exhaustion, the loss of drive to do things, a kind of an apathy related to work specifically. So there's exhaustion components or features, and then there's the negativism, work-related negativism. So a general lack of willingness to engage with work as one used to do, a loss of any satisfaction, let alone pleasure with one's work, and thus an indifference, a kind of detachment from it. And sometimes, let's say, much more negativism, an overt negativism, a persistent criticism about oneself and perhaps one's uselessness at work. I'm a hopeless preacher. I don't know why anybody wants to listen to me. A feeling like that. And then everybody else knows that I'm useless as well. So with this pervasive negative thinking, that one's performance then is no good. And this can become frank cynicism. You know, what's the point in preaching? It's completely useless. What's the point? It's not just me. The whole thing's a waste of time. So it sort of generalizes into a broader cynicism about one's work. And so, you know, I've heard men who would say that, you know, they've been zealous preachers of the gospel. They love the Lord. They've preached their hearts out, and they don't want to. They get up one morning, they find, I don't want to do this. And they find that really problematic. And I understand them finding that problematic. But that's what they know is true. They don't want to do that anymore. And that's what we develop then when we're getting burned out. And relatedly then, there's this loss of work efficiency. Now, of course, these interact because once you've got or begun to develop a negativism about work, your work performance is going to deteriorate as well. And as your work performance deteriorates, you've then got more evidence that you're a lousy preacher and you're hopeless at pastoring people and so on. So worsening performance at work will feed in as this negative, unhelpful loop. But there's not just, I emphasize some of the sort of formal preaching ministry. For a man in the ministry, then there's a deterioration in relationships and more time spent off sick. And that's a general phenomenon in burnout, increased sick leave because somebody just doesn't want to be at work anymore. And they start avoiding meetings and situations, and there's withdrawal, kind of interpersonal avoidance, because most of the burnout situations in social work, in medicine, in the ministry, in teaching, these are jobs that involve a lot of personal interactions. And it's the personal side then that can be very wearing, as we know. And it's that interpersonal side then that people withdraw from formally. So a minister, even though he finds it more and more difficult and a cynicism now about his preaching and its uselessness, he still would rather be in the study than out there with his people. Because that's easier to sit in the study and kind of fester rather than be interacting with the people in the church. So he's preferring his paperwork, even his administration, anything, to actually being out there and visiting and engaging with his flock. These are the sorts of things that we find then in men in the ministry who are getting burned out. More generally in other workplaces then, this dropping off of performance and a breaking down of relationships and withdrawing from relationships. So we have these domains in burnout. It's work-related, it's an occupational condition, exhaustion, negativism, reduced performance, poorer performance at work. And of course, as I've said all these things, and you've been thinking, but hey, Alan, I get these things. I have times when I don't want to get out of bed in the morning to go to work. And I have times when I think I'm rubbish at my job. And I have times when I think I want to jack it all in and I can't be bothered anymore. And this is generally true in medicine. You know, the man who's got a pain in his chest thinks he's got heart disease. The woman with a pain in somewhere else thinks she's got cancer. You know, we think of all these things and medical symptoms and these features I'm talking about in burnout are common experiences. But that doesn't mean you've got burnout. It doesn't mean you are burning out. This is part of the difficulties of life and doing work in a fallen world. We all get these things from time to time. The concern is when they're persistent for burnout, when these features persist and when they get worse and they become more and more broad. So you really, it's not just that occasionally you think, oh, you know, it's a terrible sermon, or I hashed up that part of the message, or oh, I wish I'd said that to her when I visited, and you feel bad about it. It's not just that from time to time, it's just they're all the time, and it just gets worse, and there's an active withdrawal. And once you're down that road, then you're on the road to burnout. So it's not the occasional features of what I've been talking about that we all have, it's their persistence and their spreading dominance in your life. So risk factors for burnout. So if we think about burnout, how does somebody get burned out? So we think again, as I think I've talked before here, about the stress vulnerability model of illness. So there's this mismatch between the stress or the workload that you have and your own ability to cope with it. That's at the center of it. It's not the only thing that's at play, but it's this mismatch between you and the workload. So how do you think about this mismatch in workload? I mean, what is too much work for you? What is an overload in your work that's going to push you towards burnout? Well, this is where we need to think about each of us needs to think about ourselves as individuals, isn't it? We're different people, and as different people, we can manage different amounts of work. So the people that, for want of better terms, I'd call strong or high energy individuals. You have people who are just incredible in their capacity to take on immense amounts of work and do it day after day after day, and to sustain this over months and years. And I work with some people like this. It's incredible. I think, gosh, I can't do anything like that. And then at the other end, we have, as I say, for want of better terms, weak or low energy individuals who can struggle even with what we might say was an ordinary job. The ordinary workload can be too much for a more low energy person. So that just that job in an ordinary capacity overwhelms them and leads them to burnout. So we need to think, well, where am I then on this spectrum? Am I a high energy person or a low energy person? We need to be honest with ourselves, help those around us to be honest with us about who we are and what we can manage, because we all have breaking points. We all will break at some point if the workload becomes too much. It's just some people will be much more workload to push them over the top into burnout. I just want to emphasize this then, because I think, again, I'm coming back to this psychosomatic thing, but there's this kind of Christian difference, I think, between how we view the physical and the mental. So, we went through all the peculiarities of COVID, and I had this weird kind of experience. I felt like somebody walking through a battlefield with bullets and shrapnel flying all around me, and nothing touched me. My wife got COVID again and again. People at work got COVID again and again. My patients got COVID again and again. And I didn't. Now, that's not because I was some kind of superior being. It's I know, because the Lord had programmed me with an immune system that happened to be particularly effective in dealing with COVID. For some reasons, it just didn't touch me. Just doesn't affect me. Other viruses do, but COVID didn't. At the same time, I've never had burnout, and I've never had an anxiety disorder or any form of mental illness. So does that make me somehow superior or a better kind of person? No, see, it doesn't, because again, I'm equipped in some way that the Lord has made me with a soul or mind that is able to bear things better and resist the stresses and everything that precipitate mental illnesses better than other people. But that doesn't make me superior any more than my physical ability to withstand COVID, if you like. It makes me better as well. Psychosomatically, the Lord's equipped me as perhaps a more higher energy individual who's able to cope better. But that's how I am made. It isn't an achievement of me. And our tendency sometimes is to look on people who have mental illnesses or have burned out and to think it's their fault. Well, there may be factors that they could deal with done differently, but by and large, we have our own vulnerability. Some are strong, some are weak. That's how the Lord has made us. It's not how we have achieved something. It's not something in us that's been especially morally better or anything like that. It's just some of us are more vulnerable, some of us are stronger. But that's just how God has made us. Just as he's made some of us taller and some of us shorter and so on, we are made differently. And as we think then on our vulnerabilities, finally, we just need to think on the difference. So sometimes these constitutional things, our physical and mental makeup the Lord has made us with, then, that's there as a kind of, if you like, a permanent core. But then there is a kind of, on top of that, things that can be changed or are changed. So children are abused early in life, and that leaves lasting damage. Some of that damage, now vulnerability, can be reversed, but not all of it. And all kinds of life experiences, especially early life experiences, leave people with more vulnerable souls, minds, and bodies, psychosomatically more vulnerable than they might have been. Some of that can be reversed, so some of it's temporary, if you like, but much of it's permanent. So we can kind of increase our strength, if you like, but there are limits, and those limits have been set by how the Lord constituted us and how we've experienced life. We can improve, as it were, we can make progress, but there are limits, and we need to learn who we are then. How much can I manage? What is the workload that I can take on? So then there's the workplace factors. We think about ourselves as individuals, my own vulnerability, my weakness. We do that by looking around and saying, well, he does much more work than I do. He's just incredible. He's supposed to be doing the same job. He just does much more. I can't manage it. We've got to be honest about that. We place ourselves, well, this is where I sit, and we've got to learn to adapt our workload. And we can't do what he does or what she does because that's not who we are. They're the workplace factors then. So there are places that are just badly run workplaces are well recognized as causes of burnout. If you come in and there's no order, if it's chaotic, if you don't know who's in charge today and what you're supposed to do tomorrow, then it's a stressful situation to be in. There is frank bad management related to that, including at times bullying, which may be covert or overt, and that pressuring of people and manipulation of people by those in authority over them is again obviously stressful, damaging, pushing people towards burnout. And more obviously, there's just the overload, the amount of work that you may be asked to take that may be just more than you can manage, an excessive workload. Relatedly, then, there are those time pressures, meeting deadlines, putting yourself under that pressure, or somebody else, your boss, putting you under pressure, stressing you out with all of that. And then sometimes you just need to be frank about the fact that the work isn't always necessarily very nice. It's a fallen world. I mean, I generally am blessed. I've enjoyed the work I do, but there are parts of it I don't like. There are parts of it that I just have to put up with or just grit my teeth and get on with it. Most jobs are like that. Even in the ministry, there will be people that you find difficult. People that in your heart you don't really want to visit or talk with because you just find them so hard. And so if you're forced into a lot of those kind of situations, that's difficult. It's stressful. The work's unenjoyable. And then, as I said, relatedly, there are these interpersonal conflicts. If every time you're going into work, you know that the person sitting next to you or across the room is somebody who's had a big fallout with you and is gossiping about you and slandering you, and that's just obviously a horrible situation to be in, and again, drives you towards fatigue emotionally, spiritually. So we think then about the individual factors, a mismatch between who you are and the work that you're being asked to take on. Well, a quick biblical break. So 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah. What was wrong with Elijah? Well, I wrote an article in ET, and I've spoken on this before. Elijah was not depressed, as some people say. He seems to me to be a pretty clear example of a man who was burned out. Of course, that's modern idiom, but think about Elijah there under that tree in the desert fleeing from Jezebel. He's exhausted, isn't he? He's worn out. It's work-related, clearly. It's his ministry-related. And he's deeply negative. Oh, I'm the only one left. Only one left. And he had all these risk factors. He'd had his one-man ministry for years, hadn't he? He'd had to flee from Ahab to a foreign land. When he came back, he had alone to confront these hundreds of false prophets, the king or the power brokers in the land. Here he is on his own, isolated, alone. He's emotionally draining to take these people on. Physically exhausting, slaying all those prophets, exhausting work. And then after it all, it goes so terribly wrong because Jezebel's still alive and well and after him, trying to kill him. So he flees from her threats. Now all that's very stressful, tiring, exhausting, lonely, isolated man who then is exhausted, fed up with his work and doesn't want to live because he's so useless at his job. I'm the only one left. Get somebody else to do it, Lord, not me. But of course, the Lord deals with him tenderly, doesn't he? First of all, lets him rest, restores him with food and drink, with encouraging words. And then he changes his situation, doesn't he? He's no longer a one-man band after that. Elisha is brought on to support him and work with him. And then there are all these other prophets who appear to work with him. He's no longer then on his own. So we have, with the Lord's dealings with Elijah, then this short-term rest, recovery, straightforward, but long-term change. And that then is the pattern that's established in medicine for dealing with burnout. So we come then to treatment, or first of all, prevention, because we know prevention is better than cure. So I've talked about knowing yourself. We ought to start with being honest about who we are, what we can manage, low energy, high energy, who are we? Encourage other people to be honest with us about what we can manage, who we are. Seek help, advice then, as I say, from others. You're in the ministry then. You need men, other elders, who will be honest with you and will keep an eye on you. Keep an eye on your workload. Keep an eye on you, how you are coping as a human being with the situation, monitoring you carefully. So changes, ideally, are made by you in the way you do your ministry and in your workplace, as it were, before you actually get burned out. You identify what we tend to call early warning signs, those features I mentioned earlier on that we all have, but they're becoming more frequent. You've got to be honest with yourself and say, actually, this is getting a problem. I'm too tired much of the time. I'm feeling too negative much of the time, and so on. And so you need to reevaluate your ministry before it becomes too late. Sadly, of course, it still happens. We all know men in the ministry who have had to withdraw for a period because of burnouts. Sometimes it's caused other things, I've seen, but it's burnout. And they just need to rest. Weeks, probably months. But when I say rest, it's rest from the work. Remember, burnout is work-related. It's not rest from everything. It's work-related rest, not kind of total rest. So engage in other activities in the rest. Activities that will help clear your mind and refresh you and so on. And implement then long-term changes. So prevention then. But the long-term changes will be secondary prevention. If you've burned out, you need that rest and recovery, a break from the ministry. But in that break, you've got to reappraise your situation, how you do your work, and plan for the future. But ideally, that doesn't happen. You prevent it happening by changing as you pick up the early warning signs. So 3 areas to think about. The first is that the minister is a human being. Now, Al Martin, in a book and some lectures he gave, goes on this at some length. You know, the minister is a human. He's not an angel. He's not some supernatural creature. He's not endowed with mighty powers above and beyond the rest of us. He's not a priest who's anointed in some special way so that he's become immune to the burnout that other humans, ordinary people might have. No, he's a human. He's vulnerable as a human being. And so you've got to do these basic things in looking after yourself, body and soul. So healthy eating here, I don't mean eating vegetables. I mean having regular meal times. I mean a normal diet, a balanced diet with a regular routine, regular exercise, getting to the gym, keeping yourself fit and healthy, getting out on the golf course, playing football, doing things that are good for your body and mind at the same time. Having a regular pattern routine through your day and your week, and ensuring a good pattern that then leads to restful sleep. So a couple of quotes I picked up then from Al Martin. So Presbyterian minister Blakey said, and I like the lovely irony in this first paragraph, no doubt there's a certain class of truths which are taught more impressively by a man who bears the seal of death on his wasted face. But on the other hand, such a man's influence in other respects is feeble, if not injurious. So perhaps if the minister's preaching on sickness and death and he looks like he's dying, then maybe that would some way would be helpful, he says, ironically. But generally, of course, you want the minister to look credible, and a sickly man is not credible. So he's very certain that due attention to physical exercise is an essential condition of sustained, vigorous preaching. The command to be strong in the Lord includes strength of body as well as strength of soul, a psychosomatic comment, I would say. And then there's Spurgeon. I don't know if you make reading lectures to my students mandatory at the seminary. I think it should be. So Spurgeon's lectures to my students. So he comments, then other men look to their tools. A painter will wash his pencils. A smith will look to his hammer anvil forge. A husbandman will mend his plough irons. Only scholars neglect their instrument, their brains and spirits, again psychosomatic, which they daily use, to sit long in one posture, poring over a book or driving a quill, is itself of a taxing nature. But add to this a badly ventilated chamber, a body which has long been without muscular exercise, and a heart burdened with many cares, we've all the elements of preparing a seething cauldron of despair, or burnout in modern idiom. And he continues, a day's breathing of fresh air upon the hills, or a few hours' ramble in the beechwoods, would sweep the cobwebs out of the brains of scores of our toiling ministers who are now but half alive. So regular exercise, healthy living, look after yourself as a human being. Secondly, the minister is a Christian. First and foremost, the minister is a man of God, a Christian. And therefore, he must manage his Christian lifestyle before, as it were, he manages his ministry. So Al Martin says to ministers then, don't allow your ministerial duties to erode your personal walk with the Lord. Your times of prayer must not always be times for the flock. Your times then reading the Bible should not always be looking for prayer, looking for points to preach on, or subjects then to develop into sermons. It's a killing way to approach the Bible. It's a danger for the minister always reading to find things to preach, instead of loving the Lord through the scriptures and maintaining his own and developing his own walk with the Lord. And then Martin talks about this problem some men have in the ministry of isolating themselves from brothers and sisters in the congregation, a standoffishness, and not engaging with brothers and sisters in proper fellowship, being detached and difficult to relate to, which is encouraging than a burned out man, because you're not engaging as people, which you need to do to sustain yourself. Al Martin talks about ministers who hide their humanity within a ministerial cocoon, cutting themselves off so that they feel it's safer to isolate themselves and not allow anybody to get in than risk, as it were, engaging in proper relationships. But the minister needs proper, healthy Christian relationships. Think of our Lord. Think of the way Jesus lived. He had this wide range of relationships with all kinds of people, didn't he? Relating so well, so beautifully to people of all kinds. But there were different kinds, and there were people who were much closer to him, of course. Disciples to whom he was much closer. And some very close indeed. You know, the Peter, James, John, there were those very close to him. He didn't have some kind of view that, you know, as a minister I have to be equally friendly with everybody or equally unfriendly and cut off from everybody. No, he has healthy relationships, our Lord, with different kinds of people, different levels of intensity. That's what we all need. That's what the minister needs. So minister then is a human being, and he's got to look after himself as a man, and minister is a Christian, and he's got to maintain his own walk with the Lord and healthy Christian relationships. And if the man doesn't sort those things out, the rest is pretty unlikely to help. So those basics have to be there. So be honest, review your situation and look at that. Then Al Martin comments then for the minister specifically then, don't limit your reading to sermon preparation. I've talked about reading the Bible in a way that's very unhealthy because it's always about what I can preach. But then you're reading more widely. If all you ever do is read commentaries to prepare for another sermon and another sermon, then that's deadly. Because all you're doing is reading this kind of critical, analytical material again and again and again with a thought about what's right and what's wrong very critically, and how can I pull this and structures and make good sermons out of it. No, you need to just sit back and enjoy reading. Enjoy reading good books on different subjects that will thrill your soul and remind yourself about the Lord and the privileges we have in serving him that have nothing to do with any upcoming sermon. And Martin says, don't limit your reading to Christian literature. I remember reading, it may be in lectures to my students, about, Spurgeon's library. It was just full of books that were nothing to do with Christianity at all kinds of subjects. He used to read prodigiously, all sorts of things. And it's good to read widely. Read widely so that you know what's going on in the society around us. Read broadly and deeply. Read varied literature, magazines, newspapers, all kinds of things that will stimulate your thinking as you engage with people who say all sorts of weird and wonderful things out there in the world. But it's helpful to read this. Not because that in itself is helpful, because it stimulates your mind. You think, well, why is that so stupid? How can they read them? How can they write those things? But it's helpful to make yourself think through things, exercise your mind, read widely. Then take a mental Sabbath. It's a lovely term Martin uses. A mental Sabbath is so important for the minister. So yes, of course, we all have the Lord's Day. But for the minister, of course, it's different. That is a mentally taxing day of engaging with the flock, preparation for preaching and so on. And so he needs then a time in the week, a day in the week, when he frees his mind, a mental rest, when his mind can go to other things. He can read all this other kind of literature. He can get out there on the football pitch. He can go and visit friends somewhere else. All these sorts of different ways. But getting away then from the rigors of the ministry, freeing his mind every week. And then finally, Martin says, don't allow the perceived needs of the flock to dictate your time. So there are so many problems in many churches. So many people with difficulties that a minister can be on a treadmill all the time, just visiting, dealing with these things, never having time then for constructive pastoral visiting, always driven by this problem and that sickness and this need, always reactive, never in control, and running out of time then for formal ministry as well. So do not let, Martin said, you must demarcate time. You must demarcate time. This leads then to time management, because like other people, I've seen ministers, and a lot of ministers are not very good at time management. They're not very good. And it's difficult because many of us would probably be bad at time management because we're in workplaces, we're kind of constrained by the structure of the workplace. The problem for a minister is he hasn't got that kind of structure imposed on him. So he needs to impose it on himself. He needs to build in his weekly Sabbath, mental Sabbath. He needs to make sure he's got time for his wife and family and healthy other relationships. He needs to learn how to triage things as they come in and prioritize. So he's not dictated, as I've said, by the needs of others all the time. He says, okay, yeah, Mary there, she's got this difficulty. But, Judith, she could go and deal with that. It doesn't have to be me. You've got to learn to delegate. Learn to say no. When people phone you up, the minister will need to learn to say, politely, of course, tactfully, somebody else can help. You've got to learn to say no. When I was, a few years ago, training and mentoring a junior, a fellow, and I was saying this with him, we're talking about time management. I said about, you've got to learn to say no. Well, a couple of years later, I contacted him and I said, Paul, could you just help me out with this? And he said, no. And I said, no, when I said that, I didn't mean me. You don't say no to me. Not say no to me. But we need to learn to say no, to control, to manage our time, to learn to delegate. Which finally then, I think this is the final slide, which leads to adjusting one's job. I've talked about this. Dangers of one-man ministry, of course, I've touched on. We need an embedded eldership. The man needs to be in an embedded eldership. Not always possible, but then look to other mature men to interact with, to get support from, advice from, help you manage your weekly schedule. That you're saying it's been agreed that this is your mental Sabbath. It's been agreed that you only do this many visits, or whatever it is, but you've got some way of structuring it. It's not just all on you. You'll learn to share in your ministry then, yes, with other elders, maybe with assistant ministers, depends on the church structure. It's not all on you. You can share with other people in the congregation who can do visits and can be more effective at that. I remember reading Mark Dever and talking about strengths and weaknesses. And in himself, he said he had to accept when he was told by his fellow elders that he wasn't very good at sharing. He wasn't very good at chairing meetings. So he stopped doing that. He never chaired any further elders' meetings or church meetings. He had to accept, he evaluated himself with the assistance of others to change his work. So, as I conclude then, prevention is better than cure. Identify early warning signs so that you can deal with things and change the way you work, how you yourself operate, so you look after yourself as a human being, you manage yourself as a Christian properly, living your life properly before the Lord, and adjust your formal Christian ministry. All the time thinking, who am I? How weak, how strong, and what can I manage? Be honest with yourself, with other people, so you make long-term changes so that you can sustain a long-term effective ministry in the Lord's service.